welcome to this wonderful virtual book launch and panel discussion that we're holding today on a new and exciting book entitled Federalism and Constitutional Law, the Italian Contribution to Comparative Regionalism, which has been edited by Erika, Arban, Giuseppe Martinico and Francesco Palermo. And I've been sent a copy of the book, an advanced copy, and I've enjoyed reading it, and it's fascinating. The Italian case makes for very interesting case study to compare it with other comparative systems or that are of a federal or multi-level nature. So it's a real privilege to be chairing this session. My name's Nicola Serrani. I'm at the University of Queensland. And this book comes at a real opportune time because it's the 20th anniversary of some momentous constitutional changes that were introduced into the Italian constitution back in 2001. So this book comes at a very opportune time. Today, our schedule is going to run like this. We're going to have comments made by three commentators, Jonathan Fescher, Asanga Walikala and Cheryl Saunders. And each of those people are going to speak for 15 minutes about the book. And we look forward to their comments. And then after that, the authors of the book, Erika, Giuseppe and Francesco, are themselves going to speak for 15 minutes in response. After that, there's going to be an opportunity for 20 minutes of discussion. So please think about your questions as you're listening. And there's an opportunity for you to post those questions in the chat. And I'll be trying to field those questions during those 20 minutes and so that we can put them to the commentators and the authors for discussion. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over, I think, to Jonathan. Take over. We look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Well, I guess it's good evening to those of you in Australia. Thanks for the invitation. And first, I want to congratulate Erika, Giuseppe, and Francesco on the publication of this very important volume. I think this is an important contribution to the study of comparative federalism. And it raises a number of issues that resonates in a number of countries across the globe. And I think it gives a lot of ideas to discuss, to ponder upon when we're discussing about federalism and also those institutions that look like federations, but maybe not formally described as federations. Now, when I received the invitation, it reminded me of a curiosity of mine. You see, I have been attending the annual conference of the ISF for some time now. And for those of you who don't know, the ICF is the International Association of Centers for Federal Studies. And then members of this association, these are centers and institutes that work on areas of federalism, come together every year in different parts of the world for a meeting and also a conference on a particular topic, and that always leads to a publication. But what caught my attention when I started attending those conferences is the several number of Italian centers that are members of the association, and I'm sure, as you know, it's not difficult to notice Italians among crowds when the hands and the fingers do the talking. So there weren't just only one, but there were at least 2 or 3 centers of federal studies at some point. And as far as I know, I was saying to myself in very early days of my studies, Italy is not a federation. And even USA, which is the birthplace of federalism, was only represented by one institute, as so many other federations that were in that group. So I asked myself, how is that a country that is not a federation has so many centers working on areas of federalism? And after reading this book, I suspect that it has to do with probably with the enthusiasm of the promise of constitutional federalism that the 2000 constitutional reform brought about. So it's answered some of my questions. Now, what I will try to do here is mention a couple of issues by way of questions and comments, comment and issues that arise from the book, and that, in my opinion, raise questions that are relevant to comparative federalism. Of course, there are many of those issues in the book, but I will focus on few, and I will do so by reflecting on and also relating to the experience of federations in Africa, which is my main area of research and teaching. Now, let me start. The Italian case, I think, brings to fore one of the questions that continues to appear in the federalism literature, in any conversation on federations, and that is the issue of terminology. As you know, not few countries are reluctant to use the term federalism. And in some countries, I think the term federalism provokes strong reaction. And there are countries that reject the use of the term federalism because of historical and political reasons. So as a result, there is often a debate on whether the term a country uses to describe itself, its multi-level system of government, is accurate. For example, Kenya ticks, in my opinion, all of the boxes of what are often considered as the minimum elements of a federal arrangement, and so does South Africa. But neither of them describe their system as one of federation. And nowhere in the constitution of the two countries would you find the term federal. Kenya has, in fact, a name for its system. It calls it devolution. But I'm not talking about also those countries. I'm talking about countries that follow a system of government that doesn't neatly fall into a unitary or federal form of government. So I'm talking about countries like Italy that do not have all the federal elements, but at the same time, they cannot be regarded as unitary, as they, at least on paper, allow some level of autonomy, some level of self-rule. Of course, some might describe them as decentralization, but I'm not sure if that describes some of these countries, as in a number of them, the autonomy of subnational units is constitutionally entrenched. So the question is, would the term regionalism be the answer? Would that be something that Italy can export to the comparative constitutional law of multi-level government, or constitutional law of comparative federalism? Would that be something that other countries can take on? But again, I think this raises a question whether we have a clear agreement, or at least some level of consensus on what regionalism is about. And my concern is that the use of the term regionalism brings to fore questions, but also some level of confusion. It could be confusing because it could mean different things or used in different contexts. For example, this is a term that is used to refer to continental intergovernmental organizations. So we talk about the European region, we talk about the African region. On the other hand, in a number of African countries, we refer to a regional divide, for example, where for some historical reasons, a group of subnational units compete against another group of subnational units based on geographical divide. And perhaps that kind of political competition or cooperation can be regarded as regionalism. Nigeria, for example, refers to the 4 geopolitical regions. So the use of the term might bring some confusion, but there's also, I think, some clumsiness, perhaps, I don't know if that's the right word, that comes with the use of the term regionalism. Because if regionalism is the idea that some or all regions of a country enjoy some level of autonomy, what would be the appropriate term to describe its institutional reality? What would be the appropriate term to describe its institutional manifestation? Although we don't use it consistently, we talk about federalism, and then we talk about federations as institutions. So what would be the corresponding term or phrase for regionalism? And I noticed the use of the phrase regional state in the book. But I'm not sure if that also doesn't add more confusion. So I think the Italian case brings the question about terminology again. And then I think that's important. Perhaps, I mean, the easy answer and could be that we should not bother about designations. And that's in fact how South Africa eventually resolved the debate on the formal description of the state, because that issue was one of the major bone of contention during the making of the South African Constitution. And how South Africa resolved it was that by insisting that the focus should be on establishing an appropriate system of a constitutional government that provides for a good and effective government rather than focusing on the terminology that we use. Also, of course, some might say that we should have a common understanding of what we're talking about if you are going to engage in comparative federalism. But in any case, I think the Italian case brings the issue of terminology. Now, another issue that I think that I pick from the book and from the chapters, and I think one of the important contribution that Italy offers to the broader debate on comparative federalism has to do with the role political culture plays in either dampening or facilitating the constitutional promise of autonomous, dynamic subnational government. So here again, I think there is some level of parallelism with the experience of African federations. Many of the countries in Africa are burdened with the history of centralization. That's the history of African countries, the history of centralization party. So the constitution of Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia, they promise a system of non-centralization, a system of sharing power. But that central promise of the constitution stands in stark contrast to the centralist mentality that dominates the countries. So like in Italy, that has made the move towards a dynamic subnational government, autonomous subnational government, very limited or checkered. In some cases, it has just the promise has just remained on paper. And of course, the situation in Africa is compounded because of the lack of commitment to rule of law and fundamental human rights. But of course, what the Italian experience also brings about is that is whether a centralist mentality manages to dampen the federalist spirit also depends on other factors, including on the local actors. So, for example, the Italian experience clearly indicates that the centralization tendencies of Rome are not equally resisted by subnational unit. So South Tyrol, for example, clearly asserts its distinctiveness and its autonomy. But Sicilia and Sardinia, one of the other special regions, concentrates on less on asserting its distinctiveness or asserting its autonomy and more on creating relationship and good partnership with the central government. So the Italian experience clearly also shows that we cannot always blame the central government, that we should also look into the views and actions of subnational government. So what explains those actions? of subnational government. And I think this brings to the fore the question whether it's institutions or extra institutional factors that might determine or structure political behavior. So I think that is another issue that perhaps the Italian experience and the discussions from the book bring about. Now, in a context where centralist mentality kind of dominates the polity, I think one of the best hope for the promise of autonomy, the promise of federalism to come into reality might be the courts. Now, the courts can help limit the centralist tendencies of national government. But whether the courts will come to the rescue of subnational government is not always guaranteed. And that again is evident from the Italian experience. The courts have not always been generous in the interpretation of the parts of the regional government, and the chapter on the constitutional court clearly shows that the court have, in fact, in some cases, used the principle of loyal cooperation to limit the powers of regional government and even empower central government. So this, again, for me, raises a question whether courts that operate in a context of a reluctant federation or a system that gives autonomous arrangements reluctantly are likely to side with central government. And I ask this question because we also have some level of that in South Africa, where the courts have interpreted provincial powers narrowly. So the question is whether in a country where autonomy arrangements are not embraced wholly or full-heartedly, could it be that courts are hesitant, reluctant to strengthen self-rule and are more likely to empower central governments? So that's one of the questions that perhaps that comparative federalism have an answer to or can grapple with. Another point that of course, that one cannot avoid raising, and that comes out clearly in the book by in the book, but also in the chapter by Francesco, is about this important feature of the Italian system, which is the asymmetry of Italian regionalism, and that obviously from the beginning and also continues to be the main feature of Italian regionalism. And this raises a question whether this is a model to the countries that do not want to go fully federal, but somehow has to extend autonomy in order to maintain peace and political stability. It is something that can be emulated by some African countries, for example. As I said, many African countries are very suspicious of federalism and are very unlikely to adopt a federal arrangement. Yet they face a demand for autonomy. So can these countries, for example, countries like Uganda, for example, which continue to face a strong demand for a federal arrangement from a specific territory and specific community, respond to the concern by going the Italian way, that is by providing this asymmetrical arrangement? So can, for example, Uganda do the same to accommodate the claims of the Buganda by going regionalism, by giving special powers to some sections or to territories and hope to deflect the move toward this federalism or a full-fledged federal arrangement? Could that be something to consider? But I think what's also noted in the Italian experience is the trend that asymmetry has often been also counteracted or followed by more symmetrical tendencies. And of course, this is not unique to Italy. We have seen it in Spain, for example, I think, but also recently in India, when the government decided to abolish the special status of the states of Jammu and Kashmir. And the question is, what does this say about asymmetrical arrangements? Does this suggest that in the long run, differentiated treatment is not sustainable because it brings resentment, but also because of other considerations. One more point that I want to raise is that in relation to asymmetry, what is the implication of asymmetrical arrangement for intergovernmental relations? As you know, often intergovernmental structures and agreements that facilitate vertical and also horizontal collaboration are multilateral. They bring together all of the constituent units of a country. But it also seems from the Italian experience that the presence of subnational units that claim distinctiveness and that are often quicker to assert their autonomy and enjoy some differentiated treatment often opt or are likely to rely on bilateral forums and bilateral agreements. And in Italy, I think we have the Standing Conference of the State and Regions. That's a multilateral institution that brings together all of the presence of all ordinary and special regions and the national government. But in addition to that multilateral forum, you also have these special bilateral committees, which have been established to facilitate intergovernmental interaction between each of the special regions and the national government. Now, these are institutions that are composed of equal number of representatives from both Rome and the special region, and they facilitate intergovernmental reaction based on the principle of parity, rely on negotiation, consensus, and in the absence of consensus, no decision is made. So it seems that this bilateral committees are a very important part of the Italian asymmetrical arrangement. And in fact, these regions are with the bilateral forums are happy, and they would not bother or they would not favor any different system of government, intergovernmental interaction.
Excuse me, Jonathan, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt. You've gone 5 minutes over time, so
okay.
I've sent you a couple of messages. Maybe you didn't pick it up, but yeah.
I didn't come in the chat. Oh, sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap up now. So the question is this something common in federations where asymmetrical arrangements lead to bilateral intergovernmental forums? And perhaps that might be the case. We see it in Spain, but also in UK. And I think this is perhaps a question worth exploring for comparative federalism students. Are these good things? What is the added value? What are the lessons and for others? Clearly, the book shows that the bilateral institutions have served a very important role. And they might, in some cases, make the multilateral forums irrelevant for some of the regions. But also, it shows that the Italian experience also shows that the bilateral forums are not also used always by the special regions. And the question is, what explains why some regions use them and others do not? So let me stop here. Sorry for taking more time. And I just want to say congratulations on this important volume. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next speaker is Asanga Walikala, who's a lecturer in public law at the School of Law at the University of Edinburgh. So over to you, Asanga. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for the invitation. What I have to say tracks a lot of what Jonathan was saying from the sort of African comparative sort of perspective in Asia as well, and certainly the places that I have an interest in. Many of those questions have resonance. My approach in discussing this book, and first of all, of course, congratulations to Erika, Giuseppe, and Francesco. It's great to be able to say a few words about this book. I think it's a really important contribution to comparative federalism. and to all the contributors. It's a really great introduction. In fact, a little bit more than an introduction, but at the same time, it speaks to an academic as well as a general audience, and is able to do a hell of a lot in terms of offering a starting point, as an account of Italian regionalism for a lot of people. So that's great. My approach to sort of saying a few things, I hope intelligently, about the book is as a comparative constitutional lawyer who's interested both in the practice of constitution making as well as the theory of constitutionalism. Also, I might add, as a Sri Lankan, where I am originally from, although I teach here, because there are many similarities despite the fact that these are two countries, one in South Asia and the other in Europe, in terms of the constitutional compulsions that have driven Italian regionalism are very similar to the Sri Lankan case. And as Jonathan was saying, it's one of those F-word cases where a fundamental demand for territorially pluralizing the state in a federal direction has been resisted by a majority, because federalism is, such an anathema to them. But it's also interesting. The book is perhaps one of the first, if not the first, because this has started happening a little bit more. But 20 years ago, when, for example, Cheryl and I started working on Sri Lanka for the first time, there was virtually nothing on Italian federalism or regionalism in English. And in an English-speaking context in Sri Lanka, I think we would have gained a lot at that point had there been a book like this. So going forward, I think the editors have had in contemplation many of the debates that are happening in constitution making contexts in the global south where territorial pluralism is being discussed. I think this book will be extremely useful for practitioners on the field, across all of the areas of federal constitutional design that we have to think about. So in that sense, the book is very nicely structured. It gives a very good idea about all of the main issues. If somebody is contemplating a federal type constitutional design and wants to have a quick insight into what Italy offers from a comparative point of view, the book is great because it starts off with Erika's great historical short intellectual history of how the whole debate has taken place, and then goes on to all of these aspects of institutional form and democracy, of adjudication, intergovernmental relations, fiscal and financial arrangements, party systems, sub-state regions and the EU thing, but also, more generally speaking, about the relationship between the sub-state and the supra-state level in a multi-level system. The huge issue of asymmetry that Jonathan was talking about, local government, the normative principles really very important of loyal cooperation and subsidiarity. And then Eva Maria Belz's really nice little chapter to end on some of the more important transferable lessons from all of that. So in terms of the historical, the cultural, and the principles and the institutional sort of, main questions that anybody looking at federal type constitutional design and wanting to learn from the Italian regionalist model is concerned, I think the book really succeeds extraordinarily well. And very, very clearly in giving us, a very clear idea about what we can learn from there, while also pointing to, the management of expectations more often than not, particularly in conflict-affected scenarios where we think of federal constitutional design as offering a way out of conflict and oppression. We must also remember, nonetheless, that once the constitution is made and hopefully it comes into place, there are a huge amount of other things in the implementation side that actually don't take place. And in that sense, the Italian experience is very, very important, perhaps, to look at. So in all of those ways, I think that the course is beautifully, I mean, somebody wanting to sort of teach a short course in one semester on Italian for regionalism, here's your book. So it's very useful in that sense as well. So the editor's aims, I think, of situating Italy within the broad framework of comparative federal studies is really well done. I want to say a little bit more about that, though. But within that framework, it's beautifully sort of set out, so very concisely, but very clearly. So very well done to Erika and Francesco and Giuseppe on that one. Talking about all of those classificatory issues, that usually attend that particular debate. Secondly, does the Italian experience, as introduced in the book, provide for some kind of export in the sense of being useful to others to draw from? Absolutely. I think in so many different ways, each of the chapters sort of, highlight various things while giving an introduction, but also a nuanced understanding. So in all of these ways, I think it's also important. Methodologically, I really like that you have brought public lawyers and comparative politics scholars of federalism together in the book. This is usually, it's again in federal studies, I think this is something that's improving in the last few years, but a traditional orthodox problem has been that political science and public law, when it comes to federalism, have sort of gone on parallel trajectories without the two speaking to each other. So the attempt very explicitly to bring these two things together. So you will have adjudication as well as political parties discussed in the same book. That's excellent. And I think it really adds to it. But and while congratulating all the authors for really giving excellent accounts, I just, without taking anything away from anybody else, just say from the perspective of somebody not knowing too much about Italian regionalism, but approaching it, Erika's chapter I found was especially good because it's very detailed, but at the same time quite compact and really sort of very nicely done. Not only because of the great detail about the Constituent Assembly and Ambrosini and all of the fascinating debates about how that happened, and then the 2001 reforms and everything in between, but also that discussion actually of the 19th century, because for many of us in the global South, in the post-colonial world, where a particular model of nation-state-based constitutionalism has operated, the Italian experience of state building in the 19th century, you can see that the social science underpinning the sort of post-colonial model, there was a lot to do with how political scientists, social scientists understood what happened in Italy in the 19th century in state formation, right? So to go back to some of that and sort of remind us that there are things to explore in that experience, I think was a particularly important thing. So in all of these ways, it works. But a few points, and not of criticism of the book or of the editors or the contributors, but perhaps to be seen as a general reflection critically of our discipline of comparative federal studies and of constitutional theory. First is the classification issue, right? I mean, the book is very orthodox in the sense of starting off by locating itself within the existing things to do. I mean, the classic debates between where and what's and the thing about how do we place what. And that's one of the interesting things to me about this in the academic register, but also in the practical one. I mean, Sri Lanka, Maldives, to some extent, Cheryl, maybe even in Iraq, I think you might remember. An inordinate amount of attention and emotional and intellectual energy that is spent at the very beginning of the constitutional conversations on the classification thing. Is it federal or unit? It really doesn't matter in some ways, but it's just the way that these things happen that an extraordinary amount is done. The categories become over-determined as a process as a function of this classificatory approach, this positivist classificatory approach. And then you find that societal claims, often in a situation of ethnic or religious antagonism, then map on to these unnecessarily overdetermined formalist categories between unitary and federal, and then it actually worsens the problem than actually giving us a way out of it. So I think we need to think about federalism studies from a critical perspective about that. And one of the ways of dealing with that, and this is not everybody's cup of tea, this is not how everybody will provide a solution to this, but I think for me, given my interests here and the interests of my colleagues here in Edinburgh, like Neil Walker and Stephen Tierney, I mean, we would go back to constitutional theory a little bit, and it would ask the question, you know, what we would say if you look at it from a purely constitutional theory point of view is, look, all of these debates are about institutional form, right? But where is the meta-constitutional debate about federalism? So when Watts talks about federal political systems and all sorts of other ways of classifying, or where traditionally, all we're talking about is looking at the form of government and trying to classify these things, and that's never going to be a satisfactory experience. And one of the criticisms about that approach, of course, is that it leaves the meta-constitutional questions about the state entirely unattended to. And in fact, what has happened in many of these cases, and one of the biggest problems with that body of traditional scholarship is that in focusing so heavily on institutional form, you actually have accepted the foundational assumptions of modern statehood, which are actually unitary, monistic, and centralizing. And that's the way that, you know, with a few exceptions, that federalism studies have. So to me, it would have been nice to have one more chapter in this book where then there are all sorts of tantalizing possibilities all across dotted in everywhere, pointing to these issues. But if there was one chapter that really brought the constitutional theory matters together and did the following, which is, federalism is not merely a question of the institutional form of the state expressed as in a constitution, which then can be looked at in terms of formal characteristics and then classified. But look at the foundational things as well. What does a constitution do? The constitution is essentially about the process by which political power is translated into legal authority. The fundamental fact of a federal state is the territorial pluralism underlying it. That is completely different from the assumptions of a monistic demos, the united polity, unified sovereignty, attending the foundational questions of the state. So federalism as a totally discrete, model of state, and how do you theorize that across all of the matters that we have to think about when we think about a constitutional theory of the state: foundation, sovereignty, authority, subjecthood, purposes, principles, design, dynamics, culture, all of these things. The book addresses all of these things in separate different places, in some more than others in some chapters. Francesco's, for example, is wonderful on subsidiarity, and so is the one on, I think, on loyal cooperation. But if it was all brought together in one place and you had a constitutional theorist to really sort of grapple with this, because regionalism and federalism I'm using here in the ism rather than the federation sense, and that's the model of regionalism that we have here. It really is something, because you're then foregrounding this fundamental fact, which is that the polity is fragmented on territorial lines in one way or the other, and that has to have a separate account, and discrete and self-standing account of constitutionalism that I think so far has been missing. So those are my, I hope, constructive comments. But I really enjoyed the book, and I'm really very much looking forward to how other colleagues in the field engage with it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Asanga, and I think you made some terrifically good points there that I think we might discuss later. So now we have our final commentator, Professor Cheryl Saunders, who is the Laureate Professor Emeritus at Melbourne Law School. So over to you, Cheryl.
Well, it's a very great pleasure to take part in the launch of this book, and many congratulations to the editors for such a splendid achievement. I should begin by saying that I'm so glad this book is out and available for reference. And this is not only because it's written by so many of my friends and valued colleagues, although that also is the case. It's also because I've always felt insecure about my grasp of Italian regionalism. I'm familiar with the basics thanks to a long relationship with the Institute at Bolzano and the great good fortune of having Erika, Arban, in Melbourne for some time. But I've been uncomfortably aware of the gaps in my own knowledge concerning the history, conceptual underpinnings, and doctrinal and institutional detail of Italian regionalism, all the things that contribute to the important nuance of any constitutional system. Having now read the book, I can see that my apprehensions were even more justified than I thought. And it's terrific to have access to a work that covers the field of Italian regionalism so thoroughly, so clearly, and with such authority. In justifying the work, several of the authors suggest that Italian regionalism is an important model, and I use that word model loosely, in global multi-level governance. I have no difficulty at all in accepting this, subject to the obvious caveats that the model itself has changed significantly over time, and replicating it would be a challenge. It's been clear for some time, however, in a world where devolution is widely regarded as desirable, that there is a need for a middle way, or maybe ways, between federalism on the one hand and the centralised state on the other. And Italy is an obvious role model. It's maybe more useful than the UK, where regionalism is affected by the idiosyncrasies of parliamentary sovereignty. And it's perhaps more useful even than Spain, although as this book demonstrates, the contextual complexity of the two on something of a par. I had occasion to reflect on the significance of regionalism again lately in participating in a project for the OECD, sketching out comparative options for greater devolution in Chile that it might consider in the course of its current constituent process. Chile clearly is unlikely to contemplate federalism, and if, as may well be the case, it seeks more effective devolution, regionalism in some form is the best option. Many of the discussions that took place in the course of this project seem to assume that the properties of regionalism are more or less fixed. And in fact, that's not so, as this book helpfully confirms. Key variables between systems that claim to be regional include, as I understand it, whether and to what extent primary lawmaking power is exercisable by regions, the nature and degree of central supervision of either lawmaking or administrative power, and the democratic credentials of regions. And of course, there may well be others. This book offers understanding on all these points from the influential perspective of Italian regionalism. Now, for the remainder of my time, I want to focus on two aspects of Italian regionalism that I find particularly intriguing from the standpoint of comparative multi-level government. The first is asymmetry, and I know my colleagues have also touched on that feature. The Italian case seems to me to be both fascinating and important in the contemporary world, not only because of its extensive asymmetry, but because it almost celebrates asymmetry. As Francesco Palermo expertly tells the story, asymmetry is manifested not only in the characteristics of the various regions, which of course is common, but also in system design, constitutional framework, power, money, intergovernmental relations, and security for regional autonomy. As his and other chapters show, forces for convergence, of course, are at work, weakening the autonomy of some regions while also perhaps providing some backup support for regionalism itself. But my impression is that asymmetry is accepted in Italy as a logical and appropriate product of history and current reality. There's a contrast to be drawn here with formerly federal states, in which systemic equality tends to be a value and asymmetry an object of suspicion. The long-running debate over Quebec in Canada and recent Indian action in relation to Jammu and Kashmir perhaps make the point, although each example necessarily is complicated. I'm reminded of a conversation I had decades ago with a British constitutional theorist who argued that the unitary UK was able to accommodate more diversity between regions than the Australian Federation could do. His claim may be debatable, but at the time I thought he had a point. In any event, the experience of Italian regionalism offers us useful insights in a world where pressures for asymmetry seem to be increasing. And many of these pressures exist in otherwise unitary states, the Bangsamoro in the Philippines, Aceh in Indonesia, Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. In cases of this kind, a perceptive observation by Eva Maria Belsa in her concluding chapter is pertinent. Bilateral dealings of that kind offer a touch of confederalism, to quote her, which, if it can be made to work, may provide the necessary glue for mistrustful partners to work together. Some current pressures for asymmetry also occur in federations, however, where it creates greater unease. At least until the latest military coup, Myanmar was an example where asymmetry seemed almost inevitable, but often was accompanied by discussions about how to avoid it. If and when movement towards democratization begins again in Myanmar, these issues will certainly be live there, and asymmetrical Italian regionalism could be an instructive example. The second aspect of Italian regionalism about which I wish to say something lies at its heart, the combination of devolution with undivided state sovereignty. I realise that this is the sine qua non of our topic, but let me try to explain my particular interest in it. The imperative for regionalism to be combined with state sovereignty seems to me to draw on an understanding of sovereignty that most common lawyers don't quite share, based as it is on the legitimacy that flows from the necessity for an undivided and indivisible demos. As I understand it, this conception of sovereignty implicitly limits the degree of devolution that is possible, whatever the Constitution provides. Exactly where these limits lie may differ between regionalised states, between Italy and Spain, for example. This collection offers considerable insights into where the limits of devolution lie in Italy. They apparently accommodate regional exercise of primary legislative power, tolerate some identity claims as long as they're understood as rhetorical, but preclude, for example, the description of regional assemblies as parliaments or autonomy statutes as constitutions. I wonder whether the need to safeguard sovereignty, thus understood, also feeds into other distinctive and interesting aspects of Italian regionalism. One is the Italian understanding of concurrent power, a term that's used in a bewildering variety of ways in systems of multi-level government, to which the Italian usage makes a distinctive contribution. And another is the Italian understanding of loyal cooperation, as explained by Jens Wolk in his interesting chapter. This concept is underdeveloped in common law federations to the extent that it exists at all. On the account of this book, however, its meaning and usage also differs considerably between systems of multi-level government in which the concept is otherwise familiar. Regionalism, as theorised and practiced in Italy, starkly raises the question of the distinction between regionalism and federalism. There's a tendency to push the question aside in this book by using coming together federation, US style, as the exemplar of a federation. This eases the problem in the sense that it explains the division of sovereignty by reference to the pre-federation status of the constituent units. This answer is not entirely satisfactory, however. It's notoriously difficult to characterise most federations as coming together. Many have aspects of disaggregation as well. Even in federations that can be claimed as coming together, such as Australia, the constituent units did not necessarily have prior sovereign status. Most importantly of all, perhaps, disaggregation is now overwhelmingly the manner in which federations are formed, with Nepal a recent example and Myanmar one day perhaps on the horizon. And so the question remains, how to distinguish between regionalism Italian style and the forms of federation emerging in the world today, if indeed such a distinction is possible. Of course, in practical terms, it's very difficult to draw the line between Italian regionalism at a particular point in time, say 2001, and more centralised forms of disaggregated federations, say South Africa. And this, of course, has fueled the idea of a continuum. But the trajectories of Italian regionalism over time coupled with the irresistible lure of central authority, even in decisions of the Italian Constitutional Court, offer some insight into where and how a distinction between regionalism and federalism might be drawn. Reading this book, I wondered whether it might be that the answer lies again in sovereignty, this time in a willingness on the part of an aspiring devolutionary polity to claim that it can and must share sovereignty if that outcome can be secured. Federation, at least in principle, offers a basis for a greater, if not complete, equality of status and legitimacy between centre and constituent units, and in doing so provides greater protection for the autonomy of the latter. By insisting on shared sovereignty and shared legitimacy, federalism can set the conceptual framework in a way that can only be helpful in securing the cultural change that a move towards a deeper form of devolution requires. And so to this extent, it contributes to the deep transformation to which the chapter on forms of government refers, in ways which an insistence on preserving central state sovereignty would not. I think, listening to Asanga, I think he and I are saying similar things in somewhat different ways. So in closing, my thanks to the authors again for such a thought-provoking work. Reading the book and reflecting on the many issues it raises for today, I can only regret that time and distance makes it so hard for us to engage with all these comparative ideas together at length and in greater depth. But thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for a wonderful presentation and very thought-provoking. Thank you. So now we have an opportunity for the author editors to respond to the commentary, and they're going to have 15 minutes to do that. So I don't know how the three of them wanted to organise that amongst themselves, but I'll hand it over to them collectively for them to present to us. So over to you, Erika, Giuseppe, and Francesco.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And well, let me express my gratitude to Jonathan, Asanga, Cheryl, and of course, Nicholas, for accepting our invitation first, and then for engaging so thoroughly with the book. So let me just offer some random thoughts that came to mind just by listening to your comments. As I have said other times, at least on my perspective, this book emerged out of a sense of frustration on my part, because as some of you know, I do some comparative work with other countries also outside of Europe, and particularly when I was learning about Sri Lanka and when I was learning about South Africa and also Kenya to a certain extent, although I don't know that much about Kenya. I was reading the history and the dynamics and the discussions about federalism in those countries. And I was thinking, wow, there is so much in common between what is happening over there and what is happening in Italy, or the debates that we were having in Italy over federalism, over devolution and all that. And I realized that not much was known about these debates in Italy, and not many connections were made between Italy and these other countries. And I thought, you know, there was so much that could be shared about the Italian experience with these other realities, particularly, as I said, outside of Europe. And so I thought that we needed to make the effort and publish something in English that was available to a broader audience that would share these experiences. So I hope there will be some utility in this volume for these other debates that happened or happening in other countries. I think that all the discussants were very good at picking the unique features of the Italian experience with regionalism and federalism. Jonathan and then also Cheryl and Asanga were raising the issue of terminology. Do we really need all these terms to refer to this sharing of powers between different levels? Is regionalism the right term to use, or is it bringing more confusion than clarity? Of course, these are all very good points. On my personal experience is that I like to work with terms. I like to start with some terms, and I like definitions because they help me building on my ideas and building on my arguments. But I understand that there are always problems with that, because to use these working terms, it means that everybody has to agree on the terms, and this is not always the case. And the use of the term regionalism is a good example, because I understand regionalism in a certain way, but then regionalism also is used to refer to continental forms of collaboration that has nothing to do with the Italian model. So there are problems, and perhaps yes, we need to discuss issues of terminology a little bit more. Another point that was raised that I agree with Jonathan was the political culture, and Jonathan was very good at actually raising an interesting point. We tend to blame the center when this federal culture or regional culture is not shared, but sometimes it's also a problem of the local reality that does not really embrace federalism. And I think Italy is a very good example in this sense. Yes, certainly the central government is not very willing to embrace federalism in broad sense, but there is a different perception on devolution of powers also at regional level. So some regions are ready and would like more autonomy, whereas other regions don't want all that autonomy, and so prefer to maintain closer relations with the center. So this is a problem that Italy has, and of course it's creating obstacles on the way federalism works. On the issue of asymmetry, also both Jonathan and Cheryl touched upon that. I'm sure Francesco will have more to say in this regard. It's the old question whether asymmetry is good or bad. Some scholars probably also in the past did not like asymmetry because of the risk that asymmetry would divide even more the country, would not really bring any benefit. And the question whether it is sustainable in the long run, it's actually a real question that needs to be addressed. So certainly there is room for discussion about this aspect very much. And finally, as I said, these are just random thoughts, and maybe I can go back to some of these thoughts after listening to Francesco and Giuseppe. Also, Cheryl raised the issue of split sovereignty. This is one of my research interests. I try to grapple with this question of how do we define split sovereignty, starting from the US model, and then in the regional models, Italian style or Spanish style. Again, this is an issue that has not been, I think, developed enough, and it would be interesting to discuss it a little bit more. I stop here, but I can go back maybe to some of my comments after listening to Francesco and Giuseppe. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks indeed. Thank you very much to the organizers. It is a great honor to be here. We really enjoyed the comments of our distinguished discussants. Thanks to Chair Jonathan and Asanga, and thanks also to Nick for his very kind words and remarks. I'm definitely not able to answer all the questions raised in this discussion, but I certainly have a lot of material to think about, and I will surely benefit from your feedback. For me, editing this book has been a fantastic journey alongside two great friends. We led a terrific group of scholars, and this volume is indeed a dream come true. But this also leads me to some of the questions. Of course, I have just perhaps now 4 minutes, so I will try to be selective. As for the tricky question of the relationship between federalism and regionalism, we, of course, thought a lot about this and about the title of the book, and we also negotiated a bit with the publisher. In the end, we thought that there are approaches that have questioned the distinction between federalism and regionalism. I'm referring, of course, for instance, to the concept of a federalizing process by Carl Friedrich. And Carl Friedrich didn't believe so much in sovereignty after all. Of course, Friedrich's concept is not without flaws. It is a kind of catch-all theory, perhaps, but it has indeed the merit of capturing the dynamic aspects of territorial integration and territorial pluralism. Then there is another reason why we opted for this terminology. Because according to some scholars, there are qualitative differences between regionalism and federalism. According to other scholars, there are instead quantitative differences. We think that the constitutional reform dated to 2001 and perhaps, could have been a sort of federal turning point. Then, of course, there are a lot of promises that were not, then realized, but accomplished. But we thought that this kind of a terminology could help in grasping the complexity of the Italian case. I'm referring in particular to two elements: the issue of the residual clauses in favor of the either central or peripheral actor, and that was a big difference between the constitutional reform between regionalism and federalism. Now Italy is a bit different, as you may know, and the issue of financial autonomy. So for that, the constitutional reform dated 2010 and one was on paper so important. And on the question of meta-constitutionalism, I think that Asanga is completely right. But that kind of approach perhaps would deserve another book, and perhaps we will do that. Who knows? Challenge accepted in this respect. But I think that you can find something in, for instance, my chapter on subsidiarity, in which I try to explain the theoretical implications behind that concept. And but of course, you're right. So federalism is also a very ambiguous. A very ambiguous concept after all, but what really matters from a legal perspective is the practical purpose of federalism, understood as a sort of instrument that try to strike a balance between unity and diversity. And in this sense, in line with some recent studies, for instance, the book on Comparative Federalism by Francesco and Karl Koestler, we took a sort of non-formalistic and functional approach to federalism. But after all, defining federalism and classifying federal state has always been a matter of contention, and it is probably impossible. So what we are trying to do, I mean, concluding, is to bring the Italian case to the table of comparative law. After all, as Erika wrote in her chapter, there was no lack of references to comparative law in the works of the Constituent Assembly. Think of Costantino Mortati, Gaspare Ambrosini. They referred, among others, to the Second Spanish Republic with its concept of Estado Integral, to Switzerland, to the United States. And then in Italian regionalism became a model in the 70s, although we are convinced that an analysis like this was in a way missing in the literature. So Italy has a lot to tell countries that are dealing with similar issues in present times. So think about what is going on with the pandemic. In Italy, regionalism has been under siege. Many have insisted on centralizing competencies, seeing in regionalism an element of confusion. But we are very happy that the book was considered interesting. Thanks again to Asanga, Cheryl, and Jonathan. Thank you very much.
All right, now it's on to me, I think. So what can I add? Well, very little. Let me start by adding my thanks to all those who have accepted to discuss this book and for the wonderful food for thought that you all have provided. I think all of you in different ways have addressed two main things. One being the terminology and one the asymmetry. Now, I'll try to very briefly jump into both of these elements, but allow me to be very superficial because I also don't have time, and not only perhaps not all the knowledge that would be needed to tackle these challenges that you have posed. Now, Cheryl and Asanga in particular, they both underlined that we took a sort of a substantial understanding of federalism beyond terminology. And as Cheryl put it very nicely, probably we took the easy way in doing that. And you're really right, of course. It is an easy way to cut the Gordian knot about some terminology distinctions that are always possible. This is something that it's quite common in constitutional law, after all. It's not only in this area. Even if we take the very term constitution, there is profound disagreement in what this really means in practice. So there are variations around the concepts, but then when you want to really grasp the details of the concept, then it is difficult to see a distinction which is sharp and clear. So I think this can easily apply here. But there is also another element in that. It's not only for the sake of simplifying a bit, it's also an historical trend that is clearly recognizable in the trends of federalism in theory and practice, to quote Carl Friedrich. It is quite clear that, over the last century, federalism in all its possible manifestations is something that occurs in a devolutionary rather than a coming together way. And this is undisputable. So if we want to take a very traditional approach to federalism, then we should acknowledge that federalism has probably died with World War I, which is certainly not the case, or probably would make all our work quite useless. So I think what makes the Italian experience interesting in that is not only going beyond some terminological distinctions, or maybe even adding some terminological nuances, such as compound state and all sort of terminology that is being used, not least by the Italian literature, but probably the most interesting contribution is that it is the oldest experience with that. So if we take out the Spanish Republican experience, which was very short and very unfortunate, it is the Italian Constitution that has started in 1948 with that experiment that then has been booming everywhere. And it is now the characteristic of contemporary federal trends, whatever you want to call them. So this is certainly of some comparative relevance. And I would even dare to make a provocative point, if you allow me. And of course, being provocative, I need to be short in that. Italy, like all the more recent experiences of federalism in the making by devolving powers in order to resolve some territorial distinctions, is probably too federal to call itself federal. We see that most of the newly established kind of federal systems prefer to avoid the F word, but nevertheless they are very lively as experiences of multi-level systems, whereas the more traditional federations tend to underline the unitary features. So the most traditional cases use federal as terminology, underlying the unitary element. The most recent avoid the term federal in order to avoid to be seen too much unitary in a way. So it's probably a paradox, and I just want to throw it to the audience. Very briefly on asymmetry. Erika said, yes, it's about good, or bad, and there is a long debate in literature. That's true. My point probably is that Italy shows that it's not good or bad, it's simply inevitable. It is inevitable in highly diverse countries, and this is again something that makes it interesting and appealing to more recent experiences of very diverse and asymmetric territories that need to find an institutional translation of their differences. And probably it's not by chance that all three of us editors are from special regions. So Erika is from Friuli Venezia Giulia, Giuseppe is from Sicily, and I'm from South Tyrol. And probably this is something that it's more innate in us, that we are more sensible probably than other authors about this issue. Of course, there is an issue about acceptance of asymmetry. Not everyone accepts it to the same degree, and the pandemic, as Giuseppe has mentioned, has challenged this acceptance. Yeah, I think the fact that it is inevitable cuts the long story short, and it's only about finding institutional responses to that. By the way, yesterday, there was a celebration here in South Tyrol about the 75th anniversary of the international agreement that is the basis for the special autonomy regime. And this has also been made visible with new monuments that have been inaugurated. So also these elements, as we all know, contribute to the practical understanding and making these concepts something a living concept. So with those non-concluding remarks, I would send it back to you, Nick. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Francesco and Giuseppe and Erika, especially for that provocative statement that you put in there, Francesco, about Italy being too federal to use the word. That's terrific. We've got some questions on our Q&A. And I'd like to give an opportunity for those questions to be posed. So I'd ask particularly, the first question is from Ferdus, and it's directed, I think, to the author editors. And if I can understand the gist of the question correctly, it's about how much the book addresses consensus-based ways of making and operating a constitution versus where they arise in the context of what could be called conflict, or perhaps even competitiveness or division, and draws attention to several countries along those lines. I'm sure that you can read the question as it's posed. I'd like to offer the author editors an opportunity to maybe address that question, but please do so very briefly. We don't have much time.
Okay, let me try with the second question by Esteban, also because it's easier. So those who chooses first has the easiest job. Well, easy. Not entirely, but I'll try to give at least some answer to the question about the conditions that facilitate multi-level cooperation without undermining territorial autonomy. This is indeed a very, very, very difficult point. And Italy, I think, has some troubles in that, because the multilateral instruments are not sufficiently developed. And the practical work of those instruments sometimes is a bit disappointing in terms of result. And this is because of the very different capacity that the different regions bring in them. So some are simply not able to really address the proper issues in those forums. And others are simply not so much interested in doing that. Those who are politically, economically strong, they of course tend to prefer bilateral channels. And this is good in some respects and also dangerous in other respects. And those that are too weak tend to not exploit the chances that multilateral cooperation offers. So it ends up by having, in my view, a very, I mean, these instruments are underused. The second point is probably that there are not enough. There is a big debate about, the second chamber to make it more territorial, etc., like in nearly all countries. And this is a waste of time, in my view. It's more like creating additional fora for cooperation, which kind of exist in practice in very informal ways. Again, this is something that comparatively we notice nearly everywhere by looking at intergovernmental relations. But the fact that they are so informal make them also too underdeveloped and also underused. So the critical point in Italian regionalism is probably the fact that these fora that exist are underused. And the fora that do not exist should be kind of formalized a little more. And certainly the critical point is the system of intergovernmental relations, which is not strong enough to cope with such a strong demand of autonomy. I hope, Esteban, I have given at least partly an answer.
So would any of the other authors like to address either of those questions? And also, Cheryl, because you were referred to in one by Esteban's question, feel free to comment too, please.
I'll try to respond to the first question, although I'm not sure whether I understood that correctly. So on the consensus based around the Italian constitution. So again, if I understand the question correctly, what I can say is that from my perspective, there was in a way more consensus when the 1948 constitution was framed. Of course, there was a debate within the Constituent Assembly whether to go all the way through, a pure federalist mode, but it was not much supported. So the regional model that was proposed was accepted as a good compromise. What was much more contested there was much less consensus in my opinion, was around the 2001 constitutional reform. There were heated debates in those years before the reform came into being, because there was not enough political support around federalism. It was federalism was supported by certain political parties. There was resistance because of the mode this debate on federalism was happening politically. It was seen as a divisive debate, and so there wasn't enough support around that. In the end, the constitution was changed in 2001, but again, even the way it was amended, the referendum that had to confirm this amendment, it was seen as a sort of compromise. It changed, of course, the regional model. It strengthened regions and regional powers, but again, it did not go all the way through a federal reform because of political resistance. So the short, if I understand the question correctly, the short answer is there was more consensus around the 1948 mild regional model, also because it wasn't implemented for many years after. So Italy remained unitary for about 20 years pretty much after the reform. And then there was much more discussion and political conflict around the 2001 constitutional reform.
Nick, do you want me to say something about, in response to that question?
Yes, please, Cheryl, if you'd like to, yes.
Yeah, it's a great question, by the way. It's almost a $64,000 question in intergovernmental relations, at least. Look, my starting point is always, first of all, pick when to cooperate and collaborate. When is that appropriate? By definition, any system of federalism or regionalism assumes that some things will be diverse at the subnational level. And in my experience, different states have different tolerance for subnational diversity. But once you've assumed that cooperation is appropriate for whatever purpose, I think one key point is to accept that both levels of government or spheres of government, whatever terminology we want to use, bring something valuable to the table. It's not just the centre that brings something. The local representatives also bring to the table local knowledge, local experience, understanding of how collaborative outcomes will work on the ground. Then I think there are three aspects of the process that need to be taken seriously. Francesco mentioned one, the need for capability. Subnational governments, as well as the centre, need to be capable. And I think that's a critical consideration in designing any system of multi-level government. Secondly, they need to maintain the capacity to be accountable to their own voters. So even though you come together in a collective enterprise, at the end of the day, each of those people is representing a different constituency to which they are democratically accountable in some form. And finally, I think there needs to be mutual respect between the levels of government. And then if I might just make two further points about the process itself. I think there's value in thinking about what the decision-making rules are. Are they majority rules? Are they consensus rules? Do you accept that people can disagree and therefore not go along with the majority view? And what level of transparency are you going to have for this process and the agreements that are reached? And that's a key difficulty in almost every system of multi-level government around the world, but it's a very important one that needs to be considered.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Well, folks, we are getting close to the end of our time. We're scheduled to 2 o'clock. I would love to give an opportunity to any others who are listening to ask questions. Please pose very quickly quickly, but I thought I might, seeing we're so close, I might just share just a couple of observations of my own, perhaps by way of conclusion. And one of the things that strikes me as I was listening to the commentary and the very interesting discussion about whether the terms federal or regional were suitable for assessing these matters, it does strike me that when we just use those terms in the breadth that we do, they don't have a lot of explanatory purchase on what we're talking about. Whereas what is interesting is that other terms that we use, while we know they're not perfectly adequate, do seem to have more explanatory purchase. For example, there's a lot of discussion, it seems, in the book and in our discussion about the roles of executives, the roles of intergovernmental arrangements, about concepts of cooperation versus independent power. There's chapters that talk about the importance of fiscal power in controlling how the system actually works in practice. There's discussion about symmetry and asymmetry in constitutional powers and in practice. There's discussion of different layers of government, the sense of local government versus state level, regional government versus national or federal government. And it seems to me that those sorts of terms that we use do represent concepts that have explanatory purchase on what we're talking about in a way that the very large conceptual categories that we search for, like federal or devolution, or I would say regional, have less purchase on. And I think that's probably fits in quite well with some of the observations that were made by Asanga, particularly about going back to fundamental constitutional principles and propositions and institutions and building one's theory on the basis of those concepts as well. So that's one of the takeaways for me out of the book and this commentary that really underscores the value of the book. So let me just add again my congratulations to Francesco and Erika and Giuseppe on a really good book that shows how a focus on one country in particular can be a keyhole through which one can then compare to other countries as well. And the depth at which you've done that with the case of Italy increases the explanatory and comparative purchase on other countries, because the perennial problem in our field is around coming up with explanatory theories that both have explanatory breadth and explanatory depth. And it is very difficult to achieve both at the same time, I think. And I think that thinking through the more specific conceptual tools that we have is in many ways proving to be the way forward, rather than quibbling about very large categories, as much as to an extent we need them sometimes. I think there's a real difference between an integrative system and a devolutionary system in a sense. But I think even with those sorts of categories, there's always middle cases or mixed cases as well, which we have to sort of bear in mind when we think through these sorts of matters. Look, our time's come to an end and I haven't seen any other questions come up. So seeing we are scheduled to finish at 6 o'clock, unless anybody, and please put your hand up, any of the panelists, if you have any final remarks, but it might be time to bring our time to an end. Although I can see that Giuseppe has some.
May I say, yeah, a super duper short point.
Please. Yes.
A super duper short point. Thanks indeed for these kind of words again. I think that's we really need. I mean, these large categories also because this is what the comparative law is about. I mean, we need categories to question them or to test them. So, in this sense, that I do like the point raised by Asanga. I think that is right. But that was for a long, let's say, term project, and perhaps we'll do that. But he is definitely right. And thank you very much again for chairing this panel, Nick.
Well, look, let me close by just saying, probably on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for everyone who presented today. Wonderful presentations on a very interesting book. And thanks also to the University of Melbourne Law School for hosting this event and making it possible. I think it's a terrific event. And if COVID has taught us anything, it's two things. One is that central governments tend to be incompetent to deal with the crises And so much of it tends to go back to the states or the regions. So that was a very interesting observation, even about the Italian case. And the second thing that it's taught us is that Zoom can be a way in which we can all gather together and have wonderful conversations without having to get onto aeroplanes. So all the best to everybody, and thank you. It's lovely seeing your faces and participating in this event. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day or have a great evening, all of you.